Starting with the Long Island Railroad Iceberg, I've intensively looked into the varying histories of the many commuter rail agencies of the Northeast, and ultimately arranged them into separate icebergs after deciding that a single iceberg on all these agencies would be too lengthy. This allowed me to allocate more time to each specific commuter railroad and to add in several new topics that weren't in the original iceberg. As the previous iceberg covered SEPTA, we'll be moving to the next major city going south and on to commuter rail around the nation's capital, as we'll be looking into MARC and VRE's expansive history in commuter railroading. I also decided to include Virginia Railway Express since it's in the same greater Washington DC region and close enough to the NEC, and so this way the iceberg can have more entries. Also included in this iceberg are entries that include MARC during the time between operating other commuter systems in the 70s and the official formation of MARC's Regional Rail Division in 1984 to include some more interesting topics that otherwise would have been excluded. So with that out of the way, let's dive right into the MARC and VRE iceberg. Company origins. Despite the many intercity and long-distance routes that went to the nation's capital, there surprisingly weren't too many commuter lines that stemmed from DC, neither back then or today, as MARC only has 3 branches while Virginia Railway Express has 2. MARC's Penn line follows the former Pennsylvania main line, while their Camden and Brunswick lines were the main lines of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. When compared to the rest of the Northeast Corridor, Virginia Railway Express is the odd one out, with the Manassas line once belonging to the Southern Railway, and the Fredericksburg line being on former Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad trackage. MARC single-level coach leases. With the introduction of bi-level coaches on MARC that can carry many more people than single-level coaches, the MARC IIs were seen as surplus and were often leased to other commuter railroads in the late 2010s as surplus coaches during the summer season. These railroads include SEPTA, IRR, NJT, and Amtrak. It's about 5 coaches would usually be sent to these railroads to make up one full step behind a locomotive from the home railroad and would usually be returned after a few months in service, with Amtrak sometimes borrowing a MARC cab car as well to place in front of their engines instead of the rear to provide emergency front egress for the crew. E-units. After serving 3 decades on a wide variety of passenger trains across the country, a handful of these legendary engines, specifically E9s, eventually found their way to lighter commuter duties on MARC. Most of these engines were bought second-hand from NJDOT and Metra, who recently retired their engines, as some were used in revenue service, while others remained as backup engines. Nevertheless, these venerable E-units continued to assist as lead and backup power on MARC's commuter runs until the mid-90s, as this made MARC the last operator of any form of E-unit in revenue service as one final hurrah for America's most iconic passenger engines. GB40WH-2. Quite possibly one of the most unique and iconic locomotives on MARC, these are rebuilt GP40s that, unlike other GP40 passenger conversions, were given F45 caps, HEP, and flared radiators while keeping their 4 axles and open walkways. This conversion was undertaken by Morrison Knudsen in 1993, as it was easier for the commuter agency to purchase rebuilt engines to replace their aging E-units and RDCs instead of purchasing new engines outright, although many of these converted engines would end up being replaced by new engines themselves after just 15 years of service, as most of these GP40s were replaced by MPI MP36s by 2011. While the rest of these engines would be scrapped or resold, MARC does keep one of these engines on the active roster, namely number 68, as an MOWM rescue engine based out of DC Union Station, as the engine can occasionally be seen towing Amtrak equipment as well, sometime as far north as Wilmington. MARC 7100. Blended in with the sea of inherited F7 lies a gem among the roster, as since the beginning, MARC 7100 was the only NPCU, or non-power control unit, on the entire MARC roster. This converted F7 essentially acted as a cab car, as it had a cab and a horn but no prime mover, and it was given the same livery as the rest of the F7s on MARC, which made it hard to distinguish for some time. But even though the F7s were eventually traded to Morrison Knudsen in exchange for GP39s in the 90s, 7100 stayed on the roster and was even repainted and refurbished in 1999. Amazingly, this unsuspected NPCU stayed on the roster all the way until 2004, outlasting even the E units, thus making it the last F unit in the US in revenue passenger service. This unsuspecting gem now resides at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum, just outside of where it usually ran. National Train Day. During the late 2000s and early 2010s, a handful of passenger stations such as Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. would celebrate the formation of Amtrak in May of that year by displaying a wide variety of locomotives and passenger cars from Amtrak, freight railroads, and nearby museums. Technically, this should be an Amtrak event instead of commuter rail, but I decided to include it here since equipment from commuter railroads has been included on several occasions, usually at stations that said commuter railroads operate at. Of course, this resulted in many meetups between different types of equipment that otherwise can't be replicated any other way, as it provided a way for the public to engage in railroad history and to better witness its past, present, and future. DC Union Station expansion. I fondly remember attending a National Train Day event at DC Union Station, and among the various engines out for display were pamphlets that described the proposed and still ongoing plan to redevelop the open space just behind the train shed. Although renderings may have changed over the years, the developers still plan to construct a platform over part of the yard and to construct several apartments, office buildings, and public parks on the newly developed space. This is part of a somewhat common trend to take otherwise empty space above a rail yard and developing the region for various purposes in order to build up the local economy. Although this plan also stands out since it intends to redevelop the platforms and train shed itself, at least for services terminating at the station, by installing curved glass roofs for more sunlight. But despite the various plans for both real estate and a train shed that have been advertised for some time, there appears to be no official construction or long-term redevelopment of the region as of when this video was made, likely due to the pandemic causing many potential customers to reevaluate purchasing brand new skyscrapers for high prices. They only intend to use them for half the week. Manassas Heritage Railway Festival. Not as large as National Train Day, Manassas Station hosts an annual railroad festival in June that includes a wide variety of railroad memorabilia, model train displays, and local excursion trains to help educate the public about the railroad's significance in the region since 1994. Usually, several pieces of equipment from VRE and Norfolk Southern will be on display on one of the platforms, with some occasions including private cars, EMD demonstrator engines, and even Norfolk and Western 611, all while other local festivities would take place around the town. MARC to Alexandria. In recent years, there have been an increasing number of calls to extend some MARC trains past DC Union Station and into Virginia, namely just 8 miles from Union Station at Alexandria, in order to better connect commuters in the more populated Virginia suburbs with commuting to Baltimore, as well as BWI Airport while relieving traffic on the DC Metro and at DC Union Station. This is specifically due to a proposal to construct another rail bridge over the Potomac River, literally called the Long Bridge Project, that would double capacity on that section of the line from 2 tracks to 4. And even though the bridge was intended for increased Amtrak and VRE use, MARC figured that they might as well take advantage of a great opportunity and try to run a few trains on a new bridge on their own. If completed, this would be the second example of commuter rail through running past a terminal station, the first being SEPTA in Philadelphia, as MARC trains would terminate in the middle of a commuter rail line instead of a massive city center, and would send another train set to a different line for extra service instead of a yard where it would wait for its next assignment. Although not far from said terminus station, Alexandria will be a good first step in the through running, as it gives MARC the opportunity to further consider which one or both of VRE's 2 branch lines they would like to continue further on to carry more passengers, while making necessary capacity improvements and working out scheduling with other railroads. MARC is the only commuter rail in West Virginia. Based on the current map of passenger rail in the state of West Virginia, MARC's Brunswick line currently serves 3 stops in the easternmost segment of the state, namely Harpers Ferries, Duffields, and Martinsburg, although only 3 round-trip rush-hour trains currently cross the state lines past Frederick and serve these 3 stops. But despite the low frequency of service on this segment of the line, this amazingly still makes MARC the most frequent passenger rail in the state, at least when compared to Amtrak's once daily Capital Limited, or Floridian temporarily, that runs on the same line between DC and Chicago, and the tri-weekly Cardinal that runs between New York and Chicago through the southern half of the state. This also makes Duffields the only passenger rail station in the state that is exclusively served by commuter rail, as this service upholds historic Baltimore and Ohio commuter service along its main line between Harpers Ferry and DC, which even back then was likely the most frequent commuter rail service in West Virginia. Amtrak Thanksgiving Extra. Often overshadowed by the Christmas season, the Thanksgiving traveling season usually results in overcrowded trains with friends and family traveling across the country to meet for Thanksgiving dinner. To help relieve the congestion on the busiest corridor in the country during this brief season, Amtrak often leases extra commuter coaches and engines from nearby commuter railroads, with the most well-known of these instances including MARC HHP8s and single-level coaches with an Amfleet Cafe car running between Washington, D.C. and Penn Station, New York. Some years, Amtrak has even borrowed NJT Arrow 3s for these runs between NY and DC, but with the retirement of the HHP8s, Amtrak usually uses their own ACS-64 with MARC single levels, and now Amtrak simply runs more regular consists with Amfleets without having to borrow cars from other railroads, with the exception of a few King's Hawaiian Rolls private cars lately. MARC ACS-64 lease. In a bit of a role reversal, MARC leased a handful of ACS-64s from Amtrak to place behind their Mark III bilevels while most of their diesels were out of service for PTC upgrades in 2018. Despite MARC discouraging the use of Amtrak's overhead wires due to the relatively high price tag for the commuter railroad to use the wires, MARC had no choice but to lease any nearby passenger engines for service on their Penn line between DC and Perryville, as this lease lasted until about early 2019, with many local rail fans getting footage of these leased electrics in service. As unusual as this may look, this certainly wasn't the first time that MARC had to borrow engines, usually leading to some pretty unusual occurrences, as you'll see later in this video. MARC 4145. Although not leased, MARC purchased a GP40PH-2 directly from NJT in 2019, likely as a spare engine based on how infrequently it's in passenger service. But instead of simply repainting this engine into the pre-existing livery found on the GP39s, the shop workers decided to create a variation of the MARC and NJT liveries by repainting the right two stripes of the NJT disco stripe into a light blue, while leaving the orange as is, in order to match the MARC colors while keeping part of its NJT identity, thus resulting in a unique and somewhat cursed combination of two roads from two states. VRE leased sounder sets. Between 2002 and 2008, VRE leased two F-59 PHIs and 18 Bombardier bi-level coaches and cab cars from Sounder in Seattle due to an equipment shortage, and even placed VRE logos on the side of the coaches and renumbered the two engines to V40 and V41. Unusually, this lease equipment was on VRE for so long that not only are there a lot of photos and videos of these lease sets on VRE, but K-Line even made O-gauge models of the F-59s and coaches with their VRE logos. VRE Elephant Station renovation. Among the many projects involved in improving Virginia's passenger rail between DC and Richmond, VRE is currently in the midst of designing a station renovation for Elephant Station, the only other heavy rail station in Washington, D.C. proper, to better access Elephant Plaza in nearby DC Metro service. This project includes adding a fourth track to the station, so this way passenger service has two tracks to run on instead of the existing one, and more importantly, a new glass canopy that will be placed over the VRE Island platform tracks. Early concept art for this station showed grass growing in between the tracks of the innermost track, similar to the many tram systems in Europe, as the island platform to connect the outer track would have likely been accessible through at-grade pedestrian crossings, thus providing a rare example of a heavy rail station deliberately utilizing grass in the middle of the tracks for aesthetics. VRE Haymarket extension. Unfortunately, on the topic of cancelled projects, VRE conducted a study to redirect the Manassas line along the former Southern Harrisonburg branch to Haymarket, which stops at Sudley Manor in Gainesville. But in the end, VRE decided to follow the existing Southern Main line and simply increase frequency to Broad Run instead of diverging the branch just before the last stop onto new territory. This was likely done as a provision should the Manassas line expand further south along the former Southern Main line, probably to places like Culpeper, but I don't see why simply having a new branch to Haymarket and beyond wouldn't be possible. MARC to Cumberland. Technically, this entry covers two topics, the first one of which includes various excursions during the 90s that were hosted by CSX and MARC that ran to Cumberland, Maryland using MARC equipment, sometimes running further to the state border near Oakland, and some of these excursions even running on the nearby tourist roads, including the Western Maryland Scenic and the South Branch Valley Railroads, although MARC still offers limited service to Cumberland for special occasions. The other includes a recent study that proposes extending 3 round-trip Brunswick Line trains to Cumberland, along with one of 3 alternative routes to Hagerstown. Although this study is in the early stages of development, public feedback seems to be mostly positive, and this specific service pattern would essentially revive the Amtrak Blue Ridge, an intercity train that ran between DC and Cumberland that MARC essentially took over by truncating at Martinsburg, West Virginia. MARC Baggage Car. In 1992, MARC purchased a former Union Pacific Railway post office car that was previously used in MOW service and later the Ringling Brothers Circus train, where it was used as a parts unit for MARC's aging fleet of Bud coaches. Although, Baggage Car 199 would become a familiar sight for most Baltimore commuters, as it became the ticket office for Baltimore Camden Station until it was donated to the B&O Railroad Museum in 2017. However, the museum website claims that the baggage car was used to carry baggage in revenue service, which, if true, this would make 199 the only revenue baggage car to be rostered by a dedicated commuter railroad in the US, not counting the LIRR. Abandoned MARC GP40Ws in Columbia, Pennsylvania. For years, MARC would send their surplus GP40Ws to Columbia, Pennsylvania for long-term storage or intended scrapping. This particular entry makes the iceberg based on the abundance of footage of these abandoned Jeeps, as well as how the exact number of Jeeps at Columbia seemed to be a bit of a mystery for some time. Meanwhile, most of the former MARC white cabs were either sold to private owners, MPI for scrap, or they were converted into MP32 BH-Qs for Sunram. Amtrak operates the Penn Line. Amtrak is the current operator of the MARC Penn Line under contract to the Maryland Transportation Authority, or MDOT, since the entirety of the route runs along the entirety of the Amtrak-owned Northeast Corridor, which also explains why MARC HHP8s are maintained by Amtrak and can be found in their Wilmington shops. MARC sets a schedule for the Penn Line, owns most of the stations, and controls the fares, while Amtrak owns and maintains the right-of-way, supplies employees to operate trains, and maintains the rolling stock. Meanwhile, Chessie System and later CSX used to operate the Brunswick and Camden lines, which are currently being operated by Alstom, as those two lines operate on former B&O, then Chessie System, and later CSX trackage. MARC AEM 7 lease. The good thing about the local intercity and commuter rail agencies having their own rolling stock maintained by the same railroad is that equipment on the two roads can easily be swapped between each other as needed. Naturally, there have been several instances during the 2000s when one of 4 MARC AEM 7s would be seen on Amtrak trains further up to NEC on Northeast Regionals, and there have likely been an equal number of instances of one of 54 Amtrak AEM 7s running on MARC Penn Line commuter trains. Even though this didn't happen too often, hence why it's all the way down on level 3 and arguably should be placed further down the iceberg, they were just borrowed by the two railroads whenever extra power was needed on their respective lines, as they would be returned to their respective railroad when done. Although the AEM 7s wouldn't be the only engines that MARC would borrow. Chessie System diesels on MARC. Considering that the Chessie System and later CSX technically operated MARC's Camden and Brunswick lines since Chessie System owned the trackage, it wouldn't be uncommon to find a handful of Chessie System GP40s or GP9s leading a few MARC trains whenever they were short of power. Other less common diesels that were also seen leading power-short MARC trains over the years include CSX, VRE, and Amtrak GP40s and F40s, NJT GP40 FH-2s, as well as original B&O GP30s and GP40s, all with a mixture of coaches from Amtrak, MDOT, Chessie System, and C&O, thus creating a mini rainbow era in Maryland. As a bonus, there would also be some occasions where MDOT F7s would be seen leading Amtrak's Blue Ridge that ran between DC and Martinsburg, as well as F40s using MDOT coaches for the same train. Although, most of these power shortages would be remedied with the arrival of GP39s and MP36s in the following years, thus restoring a sense of normality in the 21st century. In fact, YouTube channel GC Alco has a handful of these videos that record several instances of unusual power on MARC trains, so feel free to check out that mini rail fitting series as well for more info. Go Transit F59PH Trial Run. I was literally halfway through editing this video when I found video footage of Go Transit F59PH number 561 leading a few test trains on the Brunswick line, and since the last photo included the F59, I figure I might as well talk about it here, even though it deserves to be much further down the list. In January of 1991, MARC was the next commuter rail agency in the US to test these brand new commuter engines from EMD, as the engine, still fresh in its Go Transit paint, was less than 6 months old at the time of testing. But despite MARC's almost exclusively EMD engine roster, they likely couldn't afford what would have been the most efficient and logical replacement for their aging engine fleet, as they instead opted for the rebuilt GP40Ws, as well as our next entry. MARC GP40. Not to be confused with the GP39H-2s, MARC purchased 3 GP40s in the early 90s in addition to their E9s, as they were numbered 30, 31, and 32, as they were simply painted solid blue and were given small logos on the nose and the Maryland state flag. Rather interestingly, the 3 engines were not given the Dash 2 designation at that point, as 30 and 31 were ex-Penn Central units, while 32 was an ex-New York Central unit. Eventually, these 3 Jeeps were converted into GP40 EHW-2s numbers 67, 68, and 69 respectively, as they were technically some of the shortest-lived engines in service in the Northeast before being rebuilt. Even though most photos show them leading F units instead of leading trains on their own, which kind of defeats the purpose of purchasing them anyways, but the more the merrier, I suppose. MARC Arrow 2s. As a good instance of using the state-owned agencies before the official commuter railroad count rule, I can now utilize the iconic Arrow EMUs during their brief time in service south of SEPTA. From the summer of 1978 to 79, MDOT leased a few pairs of Arrow 2 rail cars for service on the Penn line, their only electrified line, in order to replace the last of their MP54s on the roster, which we'll cover later on in the Iceberg. But since Amtrak also operated MDOT commuter services on the Penn line, the sets were quickly reassigned to Amtrak's Clocker quasi-commuter service between Philly and New York, and Silverliner service between Philly and Harrisburg, before they were ultimately sold to NJT in 1983, where they remained for the rest of their career. After a relatively good experience, one would wonder why MDOT and later MARC simply never placed an order for more Arrows or Silverliners instead of 1950s Bud coaches, but this might have been due to lack of funds from the state agency in favor of refurbishing existing older equipment. MARC F59 PHI. Engineering renderings try to capture how a proposed piece of infrastructure will look, usually a building, bridge, or in this case, a tunnel. So the rolling stock that uses that infrastructure is often included as a mere extra detail, and isn't always accurate to the actual rolling stock that runs on said line. No example is more prevalent of this trend than the recent concept art of the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, a new set of tunnels just west of Baltimore Penn Station, in which the renderings of the tunnel interior include an accurate Avilia Liberty, which appears to be taken straight from a pre-existing photo to correctly represent Amtrak. MARC, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Their service was represented by a silver F59 PHI, a type of engine that MARC does not roster in real life, equipped with a pantograph only found on electric engines, a feature that is not found on the F59 PHI in real life, but likely included since the graphic designers didn't want to show a diesel in a tunnel. And to seal the deal, the coaches used behind the engine are Bud high-level Pacific parlor cars last seen on the Amtrak Coast Starlight in 2018, cars that likely wouldn't fit through neither the new or existing Baltimore tunnels, thus making this one of the most infamous examples of incorrect equipment used to represent the project area. MARC E9 retirement date. Despite being the last railroad in the world to roster EMD-E units for revenue service, there isn't a clear answer as to when the last revenue run of the venerable E units was. Although, most photos of the 10 E units on the roster seem to cut off towards August of 1994, so it's assumed that the E9s along with the equally old F9s were retired around the end of 1994 before being sold off to various private owners. An unusually quiet end for one of the most iconic types of American engines, I must say. But come to think of it, they probably didn't want to make too much publicity over the retirement of the E9s, especially seeing that none of them were ever repainted into the official MARC livery, as they were likely seen as temporary engines to be borrowed until new power arrived. NS-OCS-F units were MARC units. Speaking of famous American engines, the two F9s, once operated by Norfolk Southern for their office car specials, would gain more fame in the 21st century rather than when they were first built as ordinary freight engines. But during their long history, both F units would see time working for MARC, as NS-270 was formerly MARC 7181 and later 81, while NS-271 was formerly MARC 7185 and later 85. Nowadays, 270 is on the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern Railroad, while 271 is on the Aberdeen, Carolina, and Western, but their time on MARC remains as one of many railroads that the two engines served time together on before they were famous. Proposed Northeast Regional stop at Crystal City. Ah yes, another example of someone wanting direct Amtrak service to a brand new station that's ridiculously close to a much larger station just because they feel it's a new station and it therefore deserves fancy Amtrak service. In addition to current plans to add an island platform for this Crystal City renovation plan, Portions of the island platform will be high level to account for Amfleet and later Venture Coach cars to be used on the Northeast Regional. So this way, this mini city on the border of DC can also have direct Amtrak service to the rest of Virginia and the NEC, even though Crystal City is a mere 4 miles away from DC Union Station. This reminds me of the proposed Hamilton stop for Amtrak in the New Jersey Transit commuter rail Iceberg, in which a park and ride station that served a few newly opened office buildings built in the late 90s was supposed to receive limited Amtrak service in order to further promote the station. But this was ultimately scrapped since this station was also 4 miles away from Trenton, a much larger terminus for NJT and transfer station for Amtrak. VRE Richmond Excursion Train 2013. Though not talked about as much as extending MARC to Alexandria, Newark, or Wilmington, there have been occasional talks to extend commuter rail service from DC to Richmond, especially seeing that Fredericksburg is roughly halfway between Richmond and DC. Although VRE is currently considering bus shuttle service to the greater Richmond area instead of direct rail service for now, there was one instance where VRE held a special run from DC directly to Richmond in 2013 for many state legislators to consider such a service. Ironically, although there's almost no footage of this run taking place, a single photo of this VIP excursion to Richmond at the Richmond Main Street station platform not only exists, but is also used by the official VRE YouTube channel as their thumbnail for board meetings, thus hiding the only photo of the run in plain sight. (2009) Presidential Inauguration Ticket. People have always taken trains to the nation's capital to witness the inauguration of a new president, as many railroads run extra trains to DC Union Station, but they don't always specifically highlight the occasion. VRE went one step further and offered special tickets that not only highlighted the occasion of the inauguration, but also included a photo of President Barack Obama as a nice extra souvenir to honor the occasion. It is unknown if VRE did this for subsequent or previous presidential inaugurations, namely for Joe Biden, Donald Trump, George Bush, or Bill Clinton, as it's also unknown if MARC offered anything similar for any of the other aforementioned presidents, in addition to George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter, assuming that they only offered these tickets for as long as commuter agencies existed. Amtrak initially operated VRE. Similar to the Penn Line, Amtrak was the initial operator of Virginia Railway Express service from its start in 1992 until 2009, when VRE contracted Keolis to operate and maintain the rolling stock. Just like the Penn Line, this was likely due to both VRE lines falling entirely within Amtrak jurisdiction as far as passenger rail was concerned, and they likely also provided crew and equipment, which could have also explained how VRE got their F-40 so easily. Other commuter rail lines that Amtrak operated under contract around this time include Shoreline East from New Haven to New London, which still operates under Amtrak today, as well as MBTA commuter rail in Boston until they too would be operated by Keolis. Camden Line is the oldest passenger line in the country. Since the main line of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad ran between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. on the present-day Camden branch, this therefore makes the MARC Camden Line the oldest continuously operating commuter service in the country. Even though ownership of the line and operator of commuter service changed a few times over the past 200 years, the right-of-way and most of the station stops still remain the same. Although the first incarnation of the service ran between Baltimore and Ellicott City, Maryland, which therefore only makes the segment between St. Denis and Camden Station the oldest operating segment, with the rest of the line slowly opening over time. MARC MP54s. According to the Wikipedia page for the MP54, the units powered by overhead wires, designated as PRR, are listed as being in service until 1981, most likely on their respective commuter routes until their respective state agencies. Since this iceberg covers entries from predecessor state agencies, this would technically mean that Conrail and MARC rostered MP54s as inherited equipment for commuter service, even if they weren't repainted into their respective liveries. It's just one of those entries where it's not intuitive for a state agency other than SEPTA to roster this type of railcar due to lack of footage or anything else that makes it distinct during that era, but by timing, it turns out that they were on the roster. MARC AEM7s on NJT. Speaking of electric power, NJT briefly trialed a MARC AEM7 on some of their electric routes, as the problems from the E60 that plagued Amtrak were also plaguing NJT, so a more reliable electric engine was needed. NJT was most likely going to purchase the AEM7 along with MARC and SEPTA, but unfortunately, NJT showed interest just a little too late, since EMD stopped production of the AEM-7 in 1987, just 1 year before the MARC AEM-7s were trialed on NJT. With the successful test runs of the basis engine, this resulted in ABB creating a similar electric engine known as the ALP-44, which served NJT until the late 2000s as they were replaced by the more reliable ALP-46. QIT Mafursa coaches. When Mafursa built 38 coaches for VRE in 1994, VRE was in the midst of purchasing bilevels from various builders, which even though they served to be useful for the Virginia Commuter Railroad, they eventually fell victim to bad timing since they had a relatively short service life on VRE. But of the 38 coaches that were built, only 33 of them were sold to Shoreline East, while the other 5 were sold to an unlikely buyer, QIT Fer et Titan, a Canadian mining company in northern Quebec that's isolated from the rest of the North American rail network except by boat. On this line, the Mafursa coaches work alongside former Canadian National Tempo cars and transport mine workers from the mine to the port, as they're usually found behind a wide variety of EMDs and MLWs. VRE Boise Buds on Metro-North, SEPTA, and MARC. Originally from an MBTA order from Morrison Knutson in Boise to convert RDCs into coaches, these Boise Buds served VRE for some time before eventually becoming surplus as soon as their bi-level coaches arrived, as after being occasionally borrowed by MARC for Camden Line service, most of the Boise Buds would be replaced by bi-levels. So when SEPTA was facing a transit worker strike in 1998, they contacted VRE to lease the surplus Boise Buds in order to provide more regional rail service to make up for the strike. Meanwhile, VRE would sell some of their Boise Buds outright to Caltrain and Metro-North, with these coaches often being found behind FL9s on the Hudson and Harlem lines, but both railroads ended up not having too much of a need for them after a few years as newer cars arrived, and the Buds were soon repainted and stored until they were eventually sold to other owners such as the Grand Canyon Railway. VRE GP40s. Not to be confused with the RP39s or RP40s, this entry refers to a mere 2 ex-Conrail GP40s that were purchased by VRE as extra power to assist with the beginning of the service until more dedicated engines would arrive. Supposedly, only one photo of this engine is known to exist while running for VRE, namely engine 3210, which has its Conrail lettering patched over, with the engine later becoming Guilford and later Pan Am 316, as the number of the other ex-Conrail unit is currently unknown. MARC F units in Huntington, West Virginia. Going back to the topic of CSX operating the Camden and Brunswick lines in MARC, not only was it somewhat normal to see chassis system equipment leading MARC trains, but sometimes MARC engines would be shopped by chassis system at the freight railroad's own engine shops, with one of their largest shops being in Huntington, West Virginia. Not much is known about this entry other than just a few photos being taken of these F units at Huntington, but it's assumed that chassis system performed routine maintenance or potentially longer overhauls if they had to be shipped that far away from the rest of the system. But nevertheless, it's not common to see a freight railroad taking care of commuter engines. MARC RDCs in Chicago and Ellesmere, Delaware. Speaking of MARC equipment in unusual places with no context, we have a double entry that covers 2 sets of MARC RDCs far from their home trackage, starting with RDC number 22 in front of miscellaneous Amtrak cars in Chicago Union Station Yard taken in 1987. There likely isn't anything too special going on in this photo, as this RDC is likely in the midst of a delivery back to MARC via Amtrak after recently being refurbished, although where it's coming from isn't exactly clear. The second photo, however, is much more intriguing, as it includes RDC number 20 leading what appears to be a 4 or 5 car RDC consist southbound past Ellesmere, Delaware, a town that's just outside of Wilmington on B&O trackage, which hasn't seen passenger rail since the formation of Amtrak. This likely could have been an excursion or test run of sorts, trying to trial regular passenger service past Camden Station that never further developed, so any information about either of these 2 photos would be greatly appreciated in the comments. MARC RDC Lounge and Observation Car. This entry refers to 2 little-known lounge cars rostered by MARC that weren't used on many excursions, but still have an interesting history on their own. The first of the 2 is RDC number 1, a refurbished XB&O RDC-2 combine car that MARC personnel used as a lounge car, as it was also the first piece of MARC equipment to be painted into the current blue and orange livery, and it was placed on the rear of certain excursions and some revenue runs, with the RDC being sold to the Hobo Road as it was painted in a variation of the B&O livery. The second number 1 was a former New York Central observation car which was traded from Art Train for 10 retired RDCs, as the car operated on about 5 special events and was used as a meeting room for special meetings. It was then loaned to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum for several museum trains before being officially donated to the museum in 2009, thus going down as yet another example of a commuter railroad rostering high-end luxury cars for special events. Abandoned MARC stations. Despite being a state-owned passenger rail service intended to provide a public service to as many people as possible, unfortunately not every station could be kept open, as a handful of stops on the Penn and Camden lines were shut down over the years due to lack of funding or being redundant. Closed stations on the Penn line from south to north include Landover, Capital Beltway, and Lambden, which closed in 1982, as they were made redundant by new Carlton stations, Bowie, that was replaced by Bowie State in 1989, and Frederick Road, that was made redundant by West Baltimore sometime in the 80s. Closed stations on the Camden line from south to north include Hyattsville in the 80s due to proximity to Riverdale, Berwyn closed in 1991, and Elkridge was replaced by Dorsey in 1996, while no stations along the Brunswick line were closed during MARC or MDOT operations. MARC Growth and Investment Plan, 2007. As one of many and the most well-known service proposals from MARC, this plan included a handful of service expansions and track additions that are under varying degrees of review and progress present day, with projections for 2020 and 2035. Of course, with a bunch of statistical data to back up most of their claims. But regarding the only part of the report that most of you probably care about, namely the service expansions, a bunch of branch line improvements are shown and split up into the 3 branches, with all 3 of them including through running service to Alexandria. The Penn line is proposed to be extended to Newark and possibly Wilmington, along with new stations at Upton and Madison Square, with extra tracks as needed. The Camden line is to be extended to Bayview, Maryland on single-track territory north of Camden, while the segment between Greenbelt and Camden is to receive a 3rd track, and the Brunswick line seems to have got the short end of the stick as they are only proposed to receive a 3rd track between Silver Spring and Point of Rocks. MARC Acellas. It's time for another round of comically inaccurate MARC renderings in an Amtrak-led project, although this time we have a simple reskin instead of a combination of engine parts and consoles. Included in both the original and most recent renderings of the DC Union Station renovation is an Acela set repainted in blue, black, and orange with the MARC logo on it. But unlike the Frederick Douglass tunnel, this one MARC train set is pushed all the way off to the side on one of the more outermost tracks, in favor of the several accurate Acela renderings. I guess the reasoning behind this was that the graphic designers didn't want to make her download an entirely new rendering of a MARC train set if it was ultimately a secondary extra detail in favor of the station itself, since the station interior is a project that's actually being worked on and not the train sets themselves, especially since the only people who would notice are a few rail fans who look close enough, while kind of missing the point of the rest of the rendering. VRE Genesis. I know I just said that pointing out these rolling stock inaccuracies is kind of missing the point of the project being showcased, but I just can't help myself. And I have to add something for VRE so that this video doesn't entirely seem like nothing but MARC entries. In a much more recent rendering of a flyover for a 3rd track between Franconia and Lorton, this rendering is a little bit more accurate, in which they got the coaches right, they got the livery right, they just got the car body of the lead engine wrong, in which they use a GE Genesis instead of an MPI MP36. This is likely due to the Genesis being a more widely used engine by passenger railroads and in renderings in general. So again, the graphic designers were likely just using whatever was available, but they did do a good job overall with transferring the paint scheme. And GE and MPI are relatively close companies with similar internal components, since MPI was a GE subsidiary for a while. VRE OmniRide Bus Wrap. In a rare move from a commuter railroad, VRE placed an ad wrap on an OmniRide bus that featured RP39 number V21, with the saying VRE Tomorrow, roughly around the year 2000. This was likely done as a partnership between the 2 companies, as OmniRide provides several connecting bus services from the outer suburbs to VRE stations, including Crystal City, Woodbridge, and Manassas, which is roughly where this photo was taken. MARC E60 lease. Even though MARC frequently borrowed coaches and engines from Amtrak and Chesty System during the first few years of operations, some engines were borrowed much less frequently than others and made for a much more rare occurrence. Such is the case in the late 80s, where instead of simply borrowing an AM7, MARC borrowed a 6-axle E60 as extra electric power for their Penn line, which Amtrak was more willing to lend out at this time, since these electric engines were less reliable and seen as surplus by Amtrak at this point. Once again, I would like to emphasize how rarely E60s were supposedly borrowed by MARC, as I found several photos of all the engines that MARC borrowed from its chassis diesels on MARC entry that I mentioned earlier, but so far I've only found 2 instances of an E60 on MARC. MARC F9 on American Orient Express. More so during the predecessor company known as the Greenberry Limited, MARC F9s and occasionally GP39s would be used as trailing power for this excursion train that ran 2 times a week, solely to provide head-end power to the coaches. Why MARC F9s? Once again, being operated by another railroad means that said owner can easily swoop extra commuter rail power for any needs that they see best fit, as the section of the American Orient Express that ran on CSX trackage between Chicago and DC was frequently led by CSX-owned power, which by extension also included lesser-used MARC engines that were on the verge of retirement. It's also the same sort of reasoning as to why other commuter engines in the past would occasionally be borrowed for freight runs. CSX OCS F9s on MARC. Luckily, this rule of MARC and CSX borrowing equipment from each other for service on former B&O trackage would work wonders for both railroads, as CSX would occasionally lend their office car special F units as extra power for MARC trains. These F units would occasionally carry board officials and other VIPs for the railroad, so lending them out for commuter service and excursion runs would help stretch their wheels and make sure that they weren't sitting around waiting for the next executive train for too long. The 2 F units would eventually be replaced by 4 ex-Amtrak F40s, while 116 is currently Clinchfield 800 and 118 is Western Maryland 67. New Haven Roger Williams B unit on MARC. Now this car was never borrowed from any other railroad, but it otherwise blends in seamlessly with a sea of stainless steel RDCs on the MDOT roster. This particular car was part of a 3-car experimental train set built by Budd for the New Haven Railroad in 1957 named the Roger Williams, with the car in question being the middle B unit of the train set designated as an RDC-B, therefore being one of a handful of unpowered RDC variants ever built by Budd. This unique coach was inherited on countless other coaches from Amtrak to help out the newly formed commuter service at the time, but the B unit coach would eventually be reunited with its A-car counterparts as the full train set was recently restored by the Berkshire Scenic Railway Museum. MARC Budd coaches were converted from sleepers. Seeing that MARC was operated by Amtrak for much of its early existence, the small commuter railroad would find itself with a good number of various Budd coaches from railroads outside the B&O, namely several ex-Pennsylvania Railroad coaches that were sold from the defunct SEPTA commuter rail from Detroit. But these are no ordinary coaches, as many of them were originally smooth-side sleepers, College Series and In-Series, that were originally found on several of Pennsyl's primary and secondary long-distance trains that ran from New York to Chicago and beyond. Even though these sleepers were converted into regular coaches by Penn Central for intercity service, it's still nice to know that many of MARC's early coaches had a hidden history of fame. MARC and their later owners recognized this, as some coaches were given small nameplates that indicated the original owner and logo on the coach as part of MARC's heritage fleet, and upon retirement, many of these coaches were repainted into either their original livery or into one of several fallen flag liveries, as they can frequently be found in museums and on countless excursion trains across the country. Ex-MARC Budd coaches on VRE. Not only was MARC the last running grounds for iconic E units, but they were also the last running grounds for equally iconic Budd stainless steel coaches. And yet, by sheer luck and timing, MARC was not the last commuter railroad to use these iconic coaches in revenue service, as that honor goes to the commuter railroad located directly below them. In 2001, VRE briefly rostered surplus MARC Budd coaches for their own revenue service, as these coaches simply had the VRE logos patched over them while still in MARC colors, but this brief lease therefore makes Virginia Railway Express the last operator of Budd coaches in revenue commuter rail service. MARC GP40W runs along Horseshoe Curve. Speaking of Budd cars, a pair of MARC GP40WH-2s and several Budd coaches will be borrowed by NRHS for Altoona Railfest excursion trains around the famous Horseshoe Curve in Altoona, Pennsylvania in 1998 and again in 1999. Specifically, the train would depart Altoona Station, run around Horseshoe Curve, and then travel on the loop track at Gallitzin and return to Altoona, where the run would repeat with the opposite engine taking the lead, either number 51 or 65. By that time, most single-level Bud coaches on the MARC roster were starting to be leased out as needed, as they were being phased out by newer coaches, so MARC was more than willing to lease them out along with 2 of their newly rebuilt Jeeps for such an occasion, especially seeing that many of the coaches used had Pennsylvania Railroad origins. MARC Gettysburg Excursion, 1993. Speaking of MARC excursions in Pennsylvania, this entry brings us to September 18, 1993, where the commuter railroad held one of its greatest excursions yet. GP40 number 32 leads 2 F9s and 7 Bud coaches and a Mark II cab car in the rear on former Western Maryland, then CSX trackage between Hagerstown and New Oxford via Gettysburg, none of which being trackage that MARC regularly runs on. Such a special occasion was held on a Saturday, a rare feat in itself since MARC doesn't run on the weekends, as the train either started in Brunswick or DC, as it was supposedly put together for the annual Brunswick Railroad Day Festival, although few, if any, subsequent festivals involved excursion runs, let alone ones this far from home trackage, thus making it the only instance of a MARC-sponsored train running into Pennsylvania, along with an identical fan trip to Gettysburg back in 1994, with F9s and E units on the head end instead of a GP40. MARC Maryland Midland Excursions. Not as far from home trackage, marks a somewhat rare occurrence of commuter rail equipment going onto a short line, along with a rare mix of short line and commuter equipment. Though not as grandiose as other excursions on the former B&O and WM main lines, these excursions occurred in 1996 with a Maryland Midland GP9 trailing a MARC GP39 and 3 coaches, while another excursion in 1998 included a GP40W with several more coaches, likely along the same former WM trackage between Highfield and Reisterstown. Maryland Midlands likely agreed to holding these excursion runs since they're located on a faster alignment between 2 places on the same CSX line, namely the Hanover subdivision, and CSX likely didn't have too many issues with MARC equipment using their tractors to get there since CSX partially owned MARC on these lines. Original Camden Station Ticket Car. Despite being long associated with Camden Station, MARC Baggage Car 199 was not the first temporary ticket car at that station, with the original mobile ticket office being number X4054, an ex-Baltimore and Ohio diner that had MARC lettering on its side despite being in B&O paint. Even though the car was converted to a crew car and was already donated to the B&O Railroad Museum in 1976, the car was brought out of retirement in the mid-80s when the Camden station was shut down and was reduced to a few platforms, as the car was parked on the outermost track and became a mobile ticketing office until a new permanent ticketing office was constructed in 1992. Immediately thereafter, the car was brought back to the B&O Railroad Museum, where it was renamed the Instruction Car, as it became a classroom and meeting area, as even though this coach never ran on any passenger trains, it would be MARC's only coach on the all-time roster to have 6 axles instead of 4. Leased GO Transit coaches. Surprisingly, instead of leasing some of their countless numbers of iconic Bombardier bilevels, Toronto's GO Transit leased out their original Hawker-Siddeley RTC 85 coaches to MARC in the mid-80s, where they were almost exclusively found on the Brunswick line. Despite their absolutely incredible mix of coaches and engines for both Amtrak and chassis system, MDOT still needed just a few more coaches to be mixed in with their existing fleet, which can be seen as annoying for the coach owners, but absolutely heavenly for rail fans due to an endless number of consist combinations. Interestingly, the Wikipedia page for the RTCs even shows MARC as an owner of these coaches in addition to GO Transit and EXO, even though supposedly no MARC lettering or liveries were ever applied to these cars, while Boston's MBTA is not listed as an operator of these cars despite also leasing them a few years earlier. VRE and MARC Cafe Cars. A double entry representing food service that didn't bring much to the table. The first of which involves a proposal in the mid-90s to convert 4 Boise Bud coaches into cafe cars, each equipped with a microwave, television, and booths for eating and work, thus being one of the most serious cafe car conversions by a commuter agency. Although photos of them in service are hard to come by, some people claim that the 4 cars are currently stored at the Collis P. Huntington Railroad Historical Society since 2013, where they are occasionally used for excursion service. Up next is a much quieter cafe on the commuter rail, just above DC, as some of the Mark IIIs or K cars were equipped with small shelves for snacks and coffee machines on one of the middle levels of the car, but MARC personnel almost never used these features due to low customer use, as these features were later removed. This snack bar feature was only exclusive to the MARC K cars and were not included initially on the VRE K cars. Mark IIIs are the first coaches to be pulled by a Siemens charger. Speaking of the K cars, 4 of these bi-level coaches were briefly sent to Transportation Testing Center Inc., or TTCI in Pueblo, Colorado, now MXV Rail, a testing track where practically every single new locomotive, coach, passenger, and freight car gets sent for testing before mainline use. Although, some older coaches are also purchased by TTCI for other testing purposes or to be used as extra loads for new engines. And these lucky 4 coaches just so happen to be the very coaches pulled behind one of the very first test runs of the iconic Siemens SC44 Charger in August of 2016. The lead engine that day was number 4601, which was in an Amtrak Midwest livery, as the train went up to the K car's design speed of 125 miles per hour, which is likely why the Mark IIIs were used due to their high speed and relatively low use when compared to the busier AM fleets on Amtrak. And of course, the Charger would later be pulling the K cars for renewed service, as Mark was one of the first users of the Charger, so might as well make sure ahead of time that a brand new engine works behind the coaches of the railroad that it'll eventually be working for. MARC Train Commuter Bus. This, I honestly have no clue what this is used for, but it just looks so epic. Maybe it was used for MOW crews, maybe it was used as a company car for agency officials, maybe it was used as a wheelchair shuttle, maybe it was used as a bus shuttle of sorts between smaller stations and nearby suburbs. But the fact that this 1997 Chevy Blazer was posted on our picture archives with little to no context is just incredible. This reminds me of those Chevy SUVs that were painted black and yellow and had flashing lights with a school bus sign on them, in which, in a way, it's still public transit, but it's running just for you, and that I feel adds some sort of layer of specialty with those kinds of services. But again, if anyone has any more info as to what this thing was, I would definitely love to know more in the comments, since I can't seem to find much else on this oddity. Proposed La Plata and Hughesville lines. In a very little known but amazing study in 2009, the Maryland MTA conducted a study about creating a branch line from the Penn line that ran along a CSX freight branch down to La Plata, thus bringing much needed passenger rail to southwestern Maryland for the first time since way before Amtrak. And better yet, this study not only proposed service on existing tracks to La Plata, but it even proposed adding another branch to Hughesville Junction, and even restoring abandoned trackage down to Lexington Park, as for some reason, RailGuide doesn't even recognize the track origins of the segment between Hughesville and Lexington Park. As amazing as these 2 branches would be, the study was never brought up in favor of other projects, mostly due to the fact that they would have to travel all the way up to Bowie before they can even begin to start heading south, which isn't seen as competitive as driving on one of many highways that go from the region into DC. Although, I would recommend either using highway medium for any one of these roads, or restore the abandoned Chesapeake Bay Railroad right-of-way as indicated by the thin black line on RailGuide, as I do feel bringing commuter rail service to underserved regions on existing freight tracks would do so much good for the greater region. Amtrak Commuter. Initially included in the original Northeast Commuter Rail Iceberg as the Northeast Rail Service Act in 1981, this act released Conrail from running commuter trains across the Northeast, and eventually spurred the creation of the commuter rail divisions of these public transit agencies. However, I decided to keep this entry in the MARC and VRE Iceberg specifically, since out of all the commuter rail agencies that were spun off, Amtrak was the most connected to MDOT, even going as far as to call the Penn Line commuter service Amtrak Commuter, or AMDOT. But alas, this unique Amtrak commuter rail branding would only last for a year, until the MTA established the MARC Area Rail Commuter, or MARC, in 1984, the same MARC that we all know and love today, although they would still occasionally borrow Amtrak equipment until more new coaches would arrive. Amtrak Camden Line Reroute, 1976. Technically, this isn't a MARC entry per se since it doesn't involve any MARC equipment, and it just makes a 1974 MDOT cutoff, but I still want to talk about an especially cool reroute that occurred on the entirety of the MARC Camden Line. In September of 1976, a derailment on the Northeast Corridor diverted all traffic onto the MDOT chassis system Camden Line between DC and Baltimore. This resulted in electric Amtrak trains, in this case a GG1, to be towed by any available Amtrak diesels, in this case a P30CH, between the two cities to keep traffic flowing on America's busiest passenger rail corridor. Judging on the coaches, this was likely a long-distance train heading southbound, as this marks one of the only times where Amtrak ever ran on the Camden Line, which is made all the more sweeter since this also included one of America's most iconic engines, the GG1, running in revenue service on the iconic B&O main line on their iconic Thomas Viaduct in Elkridge, Maryland. MARC Penn Line is high-speed rail. Almost everybody has a different opinion as to what is technically considered high-speed rail. Although most internationally agreed definitions of the desired high-speed rail is any service that is faster than 125 miles per hour on existing mixed-use tracks like the NEC or other inner-city corridors that run alongside freight, and 150 miles per hour on dedicated high-speed right-of-way, like Japan's system that's separated from other passenger and freight trains. Since MARC rostered both AEM-7s and HHP-8s, both of which being engines that Amtrak also rostered for service on their Northeast Regional for commuter service on their Penn Line, which is entirely on the Northeast Corridor that's shared with Amtrak, which even has track speeds of up to 125 miles per hour between Baltimore and DC, this begs the question, did MARC run these arguably high-speed engines at their top speed while in commuter service? And that answer is yes. By running their HHP-8s and AEM-7s at their top speed of 125 miles per hour on the former Pennsy Northeast Corridor, this technically means that MARC's Penn Line is truly high-speed rail, thus making one of, if not the only high-speed commuter rail service in the world, even beating out NJT, who only limits their service to 100 miles per hour. As for once, MARC's Penn Line is an example of the United States surpassing the rest of the world in an achievement in the rail industry, especially pertaining to high-speed rail. Well, at least when you have an HHP-8 on the consist, which isn't too often when compared to the rest of the MARC's roster. Maybe a Siemens Charger would suffice too, given their 125 miles per hour top speed. And on that note, we finally reached the end of the MARC VRE Iceberg. Thank you all so much for watching this video and for sticking with me to the end, as this took months to put together, and I'd like to thank many of you for providing info to make this project possible. Are there any little-known fun facts about these railroads that I forgot to include in this video, or any additional facts that I didn't mention for some of these entries? Feel free to mention them in the comments. Thank you again for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.